The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the grand kitchen, a space that had once echoed with my husband Richard's laughter. Now it was just me, Martha, a 58-year-old widow rattling around in a house that felt more like a gilded cage with each passing day. The faint, almost sweet metallic taste in my morning tea was the first thread I pulled, a tiny inconsistency in the tapestry of my meticulously ordered life. I initially dismissed it as a quirk of my aging palate, but it was the beginning of a terrifying discovery. My late husband's children, my stepchildren, were poisoning my food daily, a slow, insidious campaign to erase me from my own home. But they underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They didn't know that their quiet, unassuming stepmother was about to turn their cold, calculated cruelty into the very weapon that would expose everything, all recorded on the hidden cameras they never knew were watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Life after Richard's passing had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. I was the chatelaine of Sterling Manor, a sprawling stone house that Richard had lovingly built, a testament to his success and, I had thought, our shared future. But without him, the house felt cavernous, its silence amplifying the subtle hostility that now permeated its walls. My stepchildren, Leo and Cassandra, had moved in shortly after the funeral, citing a desire to, quote, keep me company and, quote, help manage the estate. I knew, of course, it was about the inheritance. At 32 and 28, they were Richard's children from his first marriage, two polished, beautiful vipers who had always viewed me as a temporary fixture in their father's life. They saw me not as the woman who had loved their father for 15 wonderful years, but as the obstacle sitting between them and their birthright. The change was subtle at first, a slow poisoning not just of my body but of my life. My role in the house was systematically diminished. The household staff, who had been with Richard and me for years, were replaced one by one with people loyal to Leo and Cassandra. My weekly bridge club meetings were suddenly inconvenient, the drawing room mysteriously booked for one of Cassandra's impromptu yoga sessions. My suggestions for the garden were met with condescending smiles from Leo, who would then instruct the new gardener to do the exact opposite. Every day was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a series of small, calculated cuts designed to make me feel like a guest in my own home, a tolerated ghost drifting through rooms that were no longer mine. I endured it with the quiet grace I had learned over a lifetime. I was Martha, the steady, unassuming widow. I smiled through Cassandra's backhanded compliments about my charming but dated wardrobe, and laughed politely when Leo introduced me to his business associates as Dad's widow, as if I were a relic he'd inherited along with the antique furniture. I had convinced myself that patience and dignity would prevail, that they would eventually tire of their cruel games. How wrong I was. The physical symptoms began about 6 months into their residency. It started with a persistent, low-grade fatigue that I attributed to grief. I was 58 after all, and the loss of a great love takes its toll. Then came the headaches, a dull, throbbing ache that settled behind my eyes and refused to yield to aspirin. My hands, once steady enough to thread the most delicate of needles for my embroidery, developed a slight tremor. As a former nurse, a profession I'd left behind to build a life with Richard, I was a keen observer of the human body's frailties. I knew these symptoms were more than just sorrow or age. They were signals, whispers from my own body that something was profoundly wrong. The metallic taste was the most persistent clue. It appeared in my morning tea, my lunchtime soup, even the glass of water I kept by my bedside. When I mentioned it to Cassandra, who had taken over the cooking with a zeal that I now found suspicious, she'd simply shrugged. "It's probably your medication, Martha. Or maybe we need to replace the pipes." She'd said it with such casual dismissal that I almost believed her. Almost. But I had stopped my blood pressure medication weeks ago under my doctor's supervision, and the water from the guest bathroom tap tasted pure and clean. The problem wasn't the pipes. It was the food coming from the kitchen. The kitchen that was now Cassandra's domain. I began to watch them, my grief-stricken fog replaced by a nurse's sharp analytical focus. I observed the way they moved, the glances they exchanged over my head at the dinner table. Leo, with his perfectly tailored suits and cold, assessing eyes, would watch me eat, a flicker of something. Impatience? Anticipation? In his gaze. Cassandra, the picture of a concerned stepdaughter, would fuss over my plate, urging me to eat more. "You're looking so thin, Martha. You must keep your strength up." Her words were honeyed, but her eyes were chips of ice. They operated with a chilling synergy, a silent, predatory dance around the woman they wanted gone. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place during what they called a family dinner, a weekly ritual they had insisted upon. Cassandra had prepared my favorite, a creamy mushroom risotto. As she served me, I noticed a fine, almost invisible powder, dusting the top of my portion, distinct from the sprinkle of Parmesan on theirs. When I looked closer, she quickly stirred it in with a flourish. "A special blend of herbs, just for you," she'd said with a dazzling smile. "For your digestion." That night, the familiar symptoms returned with a vengeance, accompanied by a dizzying wave of nausea and a terrifying numbness that crept up my arms. I lay in bed, the room spinning, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, sustained assault. They were poisoning me, slowly and methodically, hoping my death would be attributed to a grieving widow's failing health. They thought I was a fragile old woman, fading into the background of my own life. They had no idea I was a nurse who had seen death in 1,000 forms. And they had no idea that I was about to start fighting back. The next morning, I made a call to a private investigator, a discreet man I'd found through a trusted friend. The war for Sterling Manor had begun, and I would not be its casualty. The decision to install hidden cameras felt like a betrayal of the home Richard and I had built, a sanctuary of love and trust. But that sanctuary had already been desecrated, turned into a battlefield where my very life was at stake. The investigator, a former detective named Frank, was a man of few words and immense competence. He understood the gravity of the situation immediately, his craggy face grim as I detailed my suspicions. He didn't doubt me for a second. He had seen the dark side of human nature too many times. "They're patient," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Slow poisoning is hard to prove. They're counting on you getting weaker, more confused, until you just fade away. We need undeniable proof." Within a week, under the guise of upgrading the manor's security system, an idea I proposed to Leo with feigned anxiety about break-ins, which he readily agreed to, likely seeing it as another expense to complain about later, Frank's team swept through the house. Tiny, state-of-the-art cameras, no bigger than a screw head, were embedded in the kitchen clock, the smoke detector above the dining table, the spine of a leather-bound book in the library, and even in a silk flower arrangement in my personal sitting room. Microphones were just as discreetly placed. Sterling Manor was now under surveillance, its secrets waiting to be captured. The first few days of footage were a study in mundane cruelty. I watched hours of it on a secure tablet Frank had provided, my heart aching as I saw the life I was missing. I saw Cassandra mocking my dreary clothes to the new maid, Leo on the phone with his lawyer, discussing how to contest the will if I were to die, unexpectedly. They were so confident, so arrogant in their private moments, never suspecting they were being watched. Then, on the 4th day, I saw it. The moment that turned suspicion into cold, hard certainty. I watched the footage from the kitchen camera, my breath held tight in my chest. Cassandra was preparing my afternoon tea, a ritual she had insisted upon. She brewed the tea, poured it into my favorite porcelain cup, and then, with a furtive glance toward the kitchen door, she reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small, unlabeled vial containing a clear liquid. With practiced ease, she unscrewed the cap and tipped 3 drops into my cup. She swirled it gently, her expression a mask of detached concentration, before placing the cup on a tray with a plate of biscuits. She then took the vial and carefully wiped it with a cloth before tucking it back into her apron. The clinical precision of her actions chilled me to the bone. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a routine, a daily administration of poison, as methodical as a nurse giving a patient their medication. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the poison in my system. It was the visceral sickness of betrayal. This was the daughter of the man I had loved, the man who had cherished and protected me, now calmly trying to murder me in the sanctuary he had built for us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I saved the clip, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the tablet. Frank had instructed me to gather a pattern of evidence, not just a single incident. So I continued to watch, and I continued to play the part of the frail, oblivious widow. Each day, I would drink just enough of the tainted tea, or eat just enough of the poisoned food to maintain the illusion of my declining health. A dangerous game that left me perpetually weak and dizzy. But with each sip, my resolve hardened. The footage piled up. Leo, in the library, grinding a white pill into a fine powder before dusting it over the salad Cassandra was preparing for my lunch. Cassandra, late at night, adding a substance to the sugar bowl she knew only one used for my morning coffee. They were a team, seamless and remorseless. They discussed my symptoms with feigned concern, their conversations captured by the hidden microphones. "She seemed very unsteady today," Cassandra would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm worried she might have a fall." "The doctor said her heart is weak," Leo would reply, his tone grave. "We need to be prepared for the worst." They were writing my obituary while I was still breathing, crafting a narrative of natural decline to present to the world when my body finally gave out. The most damning conversation came a week later. They were in the library believing I was upstairs asleep. The camera in the book's spine captured it all. "How much longer is this going to take?" Leo asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "I spoke to the bank today. We're stretched thin. We need access to the main accounts." "Patience, Leo." Cassandra's voice was cold and steady. "Dr. Alistair said the digitalis works slowly, especially in small doses. It mimics the symptoms of congestive heart failure perfectly. Another month. Maybe 2. Her heart will simply stop. No one will question it. An old woman, a weak heart, the grief. It's the perfect story." Digitalis. A cardiac glycoside, a drug I had administered to patients countless times in my nursing career. In therapeutic doses, it strengthened heart contractions. In toxic doses, it caused nausea, confusion, visual disturbances, and ultimately, fatal arrhythmia. Everything clicked into place. The visual halos I'd been seeing, the nausea, the palpitations. They weren't just poisoning me. They were using a specific drug designed to make my death look like the result of a pre-existing condition. They had even brought in a new family doctor, Dr. Alistair, a man with a suspiciously smooth bedside manner and a willingness to prescribe whatever they suggested. He was their accomplice, the medical authority who would sign my death certificate without a second thought. I looked at my own reflection in the dark screen of the tablet. My face was pale and drawn, my eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I looked every bit the part they wanted me to play. But beneath the fragile exterior, a cold, hard anger was solidifying into something powerful. They had made a critical error. They thought because I was old, I was weak. They thought because I was grieving, I was blind. They had mistaken kindness for frailty and silence for submission. They had no idea that every dose of poison they administered was fueling a resolve they could not possibly comprehend. I now had the evidence, a library of digital files documenting their every move, their every whispered conspiracy, but Frank's words echoed in my mind. We needed to do more than just prove they tried to kill me. We needed to expose the entire rotten conspiracy, including the doctor who had betrayed his oath. The game was far from over. It was time to set my own trap. With a mountain of digital evidence stored securely on encrypted drives, the next phase of my plan began. It was no longer enough to simply catch them. I had to orchestrate a confession. I needed to force their hand in a way that would leave no room for doubt, no escape through legal loopholes or high-priced lawyers. I needed to put on the performance of a lifetime, with Sterling Manor as my stage and my would-be murderers as the unwitting actors in their own downfall. My health, which I had been carefully managing by consuming only minimal amounts of the poisoned food, now became my primary tool. I began to exaggerate the symptoms, my nurse's training allowing me to mimic the advanced stages of digitalis toxicity with terrifying accuracy. My hands trembled more violently. I would stumble in the hallways, catching myself on the furniture with a gasp. I would complain of seeing yellow halos around the lights, a classic sign of digoxin poisoning, a detail I knew Cassandra, with her cursory online research, would recognize and report to her brother with glee. I let them see me poring over my will with a magnifying glass, my hand shaking as I traced the lines. I made a show of calling my lawyer, my voice deliberately weak, to discuss final arrangements. I wanted them to believe the end was near, to get careless, to feel the intoxicating rush of imminent victory. And they took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Their confidence swelled into outright arrogance. Their whispers in the library grew louder, their glances more openly triumphant. They started making plans, no longer bothering to hide their discussions about selling the manor and splitting the assets. The hidden microphones captured every greedy word. "I'm thinking of a penthouse in the city," Leo said one evening, swirling a brandy. "And a place in the south of France," Cassandra added, her laugh like tinkling glass. "We've earned it." The contempt in their voices was a physical thing, a poison of a different kind. The centerpiece of my performance was to be a health crisis, an event so dramatic it would force them to call their co-conspirator, Dr. Alistair, to the house. I chose my moment carefully. It was a Tuesday evening, the anniversary of Richard's death. I knew the emotional weight of the day would add credence to my sudden decline. That afternoon, I consumed a slightly larger portion of the tainted soup Cassandra had served me, just enough to induce genuine pronounced symptoms without putting myself in mortal danger. By dinner time, I was genuinely unwell. My heart was racing with palpitations, my vision was blurred, and a cold sweat slicked my skin. I barely touched the meal Cassandra placed before me, instead pushing the food around my plate with a trembling hand. "Martha, you look dreadful," Cassandra said, the concern in her voice perfectly feigned. "You've barely eaten a thing." I looked up, focusing my blurry gaze on her face. I don't feel well," I whispered, letting my head loll to the side. "My chest, it feels tight." This was their cue. Leo shot Cassandra a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, before schooling his features into a mask of alarm. "That's it," he declared, standing abruptly. "We're calling Dr. Alistair. He needs to see you immediately." As Leo placed the call, I allowed myself a small, weak moan, clutching my chest. The performance was working perfectly. Dr. Alistair arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand, his expression a practiced blend of professional gravity and personal concern. He was exactly as I remembered, handsome, smooth, and utterly corrupt. "Martha, what seems to be the trouble?" he asked, his voice soothing as he took my wrist to check my pulse. "The children are very worried about you." I let my eyes flutter open. "Dizzy," I mumbled. "Can't breathe properly. Everything looks yellow." I watched his face carefully. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his features, before being instantly suppressed. He knew the symptoms. He had prescribed the poison. He now saw its intended effect. He went through the motions of an examination, listening to my heart with his stethoscope, checking my blood pressure. The hidden camera in the mantel clock captured his every move. "Her pulse is highly irregular," he announced to Leo and Cassandra, who were hovering nearby like vultures. "And her blood pressure is dangerously low. Given her history and the stress of today's anniversary, I'm afraid she's experiencing acute cardiac distress." "What do we do?" Cassandra asked, her voice trembling with what anyone else would have mistaken for fear. "Should we call an ambulance?" Dr. Alistair shook his head. No, no. Moving her would be too risky in her current state. It's best we make her comfortable here. I can administer something to stabilize her heart rhythm. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the act that would seal his fate alongside theirs. He opened his medical bag and withdrew a syringe and a small vial. I knew with sickening certainty that it contained a massive, fatal dose of digitalis, the final push that would send my heart into irreversible fibrillation. He was going to murder me, right here in my own living room, with my stepchildren as his witnesses. "This will help you rest, Martha," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur as he flicked the syringe to remove air bubbles. "Just a little something to ease the strain on your heart." He swabbed my arm with alcohol, the cold sting a prelude to the end they had all planned for me. As the needle approached my skin, I took a deep, shuddering breath and spoke, my voice suddenly clear and strong, cutting through the funereal silence of the room. "Tell me, doctor," I said, my eyes locking onto his. "Is that the same drug you've been having them feed me for the past 6 months?" The syringe froze an inch from my arm. Dr. Allister's face went slack with shock, his professional mask dissolving to reveal the panicked, cornered man beneath. Leo and Cassandra stared, their mouths agape, the color draining from their faces. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, almost imperceptible hum of the hidden camera, recording everything. The trap was sprung. The silence that followed my question was a physical entity, thick and suffocating. It was as if the air itself had solidified, trapping the 4 of us in a tableau of shock and accusation. Dr. Allister's hand trembled, the syringe wavering, the needle glinting under the lamplight like the fang of a startled snake. His smooth, handsome face, which seconds before had been a portrait of compassionate authority, was now a canvas of stark terror. His jaw worked silently, but no sound emerged. He was a man utterly undone, stripped of his professional armor, exposed as a common criminal in a tailored suit. Across the room, Cassandra was the first to break. A choked, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure, animal panic. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her eyes wide and wild. "You're delirious, Martha. The grief, the medication, it's making you paranoid." It was a weak, reflexive lie, the desperate grasping of a drowning woman for a piece of driftwood. But her voice was shrill, cracking under the strain, and it only served to amplify her guilt. Leo, ever the pragmatist, recovered more quickly. His face, which had gone ashen, now hardened into a mask of cold fury. He took a step forward, his body language shifting from that of a concerned son to that of a predator. "That's enough," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You've clearly lost your mind. Doctor, she's having a psychotic episode. We need to sedate her. Now." He was trying to reclaim control of the narrative, to paint me as the hysterical, delusional old woman they had always believed me to be. He was trying to give Dr. Allister the justification he needed to press the plunger home, to silence me forever. I pushed myself up, slowly, deliberately, into a sitting position on the sofa. The sudden movement, the strength it displayed, seemed to startle them. The frail, dying woman was gone. In her place sat someone they did not recognize, someone whose eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. "Psychotic?" I repeated, my voice steady and resonant in the silent room. "Is it psychosis to notice the metallic taste of digitalis in my tea every morning? Is it paranoia to feel my heart flutter unnaturally after eating a soup, seasoned with powdered pills? Is it delusion, doctor, to recognize the symptoms of the very poison you prescribed to them, the very poison you now hold in that syringe?" I turned my gaze back to Dr. Allister. His eyes darted between Leo and me, a trapped animal seeking an escape route. "This is slander," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I am a respected physician. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," I said, and for the first time I allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. "I have a great deal of proof. I reached for the television remote on the coffee table beside me. It was an ordinary remote, but Frank had modified it. With a press of a single button, the large, flat-screen television on the wall, which had been displaying a serene landscape painting, flickered to life. The image that appeared was from the kitchen camera, time-stamped from the previous afternoon. The scene was sickeningly familiar. Cassandra, at the counter, carefully adding 3 drops of clear liquid from her little vial into my teacup. Cassandra let out a strangled cry and staggered backward as if struck. Leo stared at the screen, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. They were watching their own crime play out in high definition. I pressed another button. The scene changed to the library, 2 weeks prior. This time it was Leo, meticulously grinding a pill with the back of a spoon, his movements precise and methodical, before sprinkling the resulting powder into the sugar bowl. "For your coffee, I believe," I said softly. "How?" Leo breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He stared around the room, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown. "How is this possible?" "You see, you made the classic mistake of all arrogant criminals," I explained, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You underestimated your victim. You saw a grieving elderly woman. You didn't see a nurse with decades of experience. You didn't see a woman who loved her husband so much she would burn down the world to protect his memory from parasites like you." I let my words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against their crumbling composure. I turned back to Dr. Allister, who stood frozen, the syringe still held aloft in his trembling hand. "And you, Doctor, you betrayed every oath you ever took. You became a murderer for hire. Did you really think no one would notice? That your prescriptions and my decline wouldn't raise questions?" I pressed the button on the remote one last time. The television now showed the footage from the camera in the mantelpiece clock, a live feed of the very room we were in. They saw themselves, their shocked, guilty faces illuminated by the screen's glow. And they saw me, sitting calmly on the sofa, the puppet master who had been pulling their strings all along. "You should know," I added, my voice dropping to an almost gentle tone. "The digitalis works slowly, it mimics congestive heart failure perfectly. Another month, maybe 2, her heart will simply stop. Your words, I believe, Cassandra?" The recorded sound of Cassandra's own cold, clinical voice filled the room, an echo from the past that sealed their fate in the present. That was what finally broke Leo. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged, not at me, but at Dr. Allister. "You fool!" he screamed, grabbing the doctor by the torisons, lapels of his expensive coat. "You were supposed to be careful. You promised this was untraceable." Dr. Allister, in his panic, dropped the syringe. It clattered to the floor, spilling its deadly contents onto the Persian rug Richard had loved so much. Cassandra began to sob, not tears of remorse, but of terror and self-pity. "He told us it was safe," she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at the doctor. "It was his idea." The room descended into a chaotic scene of accusation and recrimination. They were turning on each other, a pit of vipers, each trying to save their own skin by sinking their fangs into their co-conspirators. It was a symphony of poetic justice, and I let them play their frantic, desperate music. All the while the cameras rolled, capturing every confession, every accusation, every pathetic, self-serving word for the grand finale that was to come. I let the chaos reign for a full minute, allowing their panicked confessions to be thoroughly documented. Their web of lies had unraveled completely, leaving them entangled in a mess of their own making, thrashing and biting at one another in a desperate, futile struggle. When I had heard enough, I raised my voice, not shouting, but with a tone of command that cut through the hysteria. "That's quite enough." The room fell silent again, the 3 of them turning to look at me, their faces streaked with tears and sweat, their expensive clothes disheveled. They looked like what they were, common criminals caught in the act. "You seem to be under the impression," I said, rising slowly from the sofa, "that you are the only guests I have this evening." A look of confusion passed between them. It was then that the front door of the manor burst open. It didn't make a loud noise. It was opened with a key, with authority. Frank, my investigator, stepped inside, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. Behind them, more officers and detectives began to file silently into the grand foyer, their movements efficient and purposeful. Their presence filled the house, a sudden, overwhelming force of order in the chaos. Leo, Cassandra, and Dr. Alistair stared, their eyes wide with the dawning, horrific understanding that the trap was far larger and more complete than they could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a hidden camera, this was a full-blown sting operation, and they were the star attractions. Leo and Cassandra Sterling, Dr. Miles Alistair. Frank's voice boomed, devoid of any emotion. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The uniformed officers moved forward with practiced efficiency. One officer approached Dr. Alistair, who seemed to deflate, all the fight going out of him as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked down at the floor, a disgraced man whose life was over. Another officer moved toward Cassandra, who let out a piercing shriek and tried to run, her flight instinct taking over. She didn't get far before she was apprehended, her sobs turning into desperate, incoherent pleas as she was restrained. Leo, however, reacted with fury. "You can't do this!" He bellowed, his face purple with rage as an officer approached him. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "You old bitch! You did this! This is my house, my money!" He lunged. Not at the officers, but toward me, his hands outstretched like claws. Before he could take 2 steps, he was tackled by 2 detectives who had anticipated his move. He hit the floor with a heavy thud, the fight knocked out of him as he was pinned and cuffed, his stream of curses echoing off the high ceilings of the room his father had built. As they were led away, one by one, their reign of terror over Sterling Manor came to a pathetic, ignominious end. Cassandra was still weeping hysterically. Dr. Alistair was a ghost, his face a blank mask of shock. Leo was still spewing threats and insults, his final act of defiance against the woman who had so thoroughly outmaneuvered him. I watched them go, feeling not a sense of triumph, but a profound and weary sadness. Sadness for Richard, for the betrayal of his children, sadness for the home that had been so violated, sadness for the woman I had been forced to become to survive. Frank walked over to me, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Martha?" he asked. I took a deep breath, the first truly clean breath I felt I had taken in months, and nodded. "I am now, Frank. Thank you." "You did all the hard work," he said, gesturing around the room at the television screen, which was still displaying their shocked faces. "We just had to be here for the curtain call. We have everything. The video, the audio, their confessions just now. They won't see the outside of a prison cell for a very, very long time." He then handed me a small evidence bag containing the vial he had retrieved from Cassandra's apron pocket after her arrest. "We'll have this analyzed, but we both know what it is." As the forensics team began to sweep through the house, meticulously gathering the evidence I had curated for them, the syringe, the tainted sugar bowl, the leftover soup, I walked through the silent rooms. The house felt different already. The oppressive atmosphere of hostility had lifted, replaced by the quiet hum of justice being served. It was over. The performance was finished. I had faced the monsters in my own home, and I had won. But as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the foyer mirror, I knew the victory had come at a cost. The fight had changed me, forged me into something harder, colder. The final act was yet to come. Learning to live with the woman I now was. The trials were swift. With the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence I had gathered, there was little room for defense. The video footage, the audio recordings, and their own panicked recorded confessions painted a picture so damning that their high-priced lawyers could do little more than plead for mercy. They received none. Leo and Cassandra were sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy and attempted murder. Dr. Alistair, for his role as the medical architect of the plot, received the same. The media frenzy was intense, a circus of headlines about the Sterling Manor poison plot. I was painted as a hero, a clever and courageous widow who had outsmarted her would-be killers. But I felt little of the heroism they described. In the months that followed, I focused on cleansing Stirling Manor of their toxic presence. It was a slow, deliberate process of reclamation. I hired a new staff, kind people who brought warmth and laughter back into the silent hallways. I had the entire kitchen sanitized and remodeled, purging the space where the poison had been prepared. I donated every piece of furniture Leo and Cassandra had brought into the house, erasing their physical footprint. But erasing the emotional scars was a much harder task. There were days when the silence of the house felt heavy again, when I would catch myself listening for footsteps that were no longer there. The memory of their betrayal was a ghost that lingered long after they were gone. I found solace in the garden. I spent hours with my hands in the earth, nurturing new life, willing beauty to grow in the place of ugliness. I planted roses in Richard's memory, their vibrant colors, a defiant statement against the darkness that had tried to take root here. It was in the garden that I began to heal, to reconnect with the woman I had been before the poisoning, before the fight. I was still Martha, but a different version. I was stronger, more resilient, and acutely aware of my own capacity for survival. I had learned that true strength wasn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the arrests, Frank came to visit. He found me in the garden, pruning the roses. "The place looks good, Martha," he said, smiling. "It suits you." "It's finally starting to feel like home again," I admitted. We sat on a bench overlooking the rolling lawns, the air peaceful. "I came to tell you that Leo and Cassandra lost their final appeal," he said quietly. "It's officially over." I nodded, a sense of finality washing over me. "Thank you for everything, Frank. I couldn't have done it without you." "You would have found a way," he said with conviction. "You're the toughest woman I've ever met." As he left, I looked around at the manor, its stone walls glowing in the afternoon sun. It was no longer a gilded cage or a battlefield. It was my home, a sanctuary I had fought for and won. The poison had been purged, not just from the sugar bowl, but from the very soul of the house. I had faced the darkest parts of human nature, and had not only survived but had triumphed. I was 59 years old, a widow, a survivor, and for the first time in a very long time I felt a sense of peace. The war was over, and as I snipped a perfect crimson rose from the bush, I knew I was finally, truly, free. The story of Stirling Manor would no longer be one of betrayal and death, but one of resilience, justice, and the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who refused to be erased. The changing of the seasons at Stirling Manor had once been a source of profound joy for Richard and me. We would watch the first snowfall blanket the great lawn from the library window, a fire crackling in the hearth, mugs of mulled wine warming our hands. Now, as winter descended in the year following the trials, the silence of the house felt different. It was no longer the oppressive, hostile silence of Leo and Cassandra's tenure. But it wasn't the peaceful, companionable silence I had shared with my husband either. It was a hollow silence filled with echoes. The victory that had felt so absolute in the courtroom began to feel fragile within the walls of my own home. The legal battle was over, but the psychological war, I soon discovered, was a conflict I would be fighting alone. Paranoia became my unwelcome house guest. Every time a new staff member, however kind and well-vetted, prepared a meal for me, a sliver of ice would slide into my gut. I found myself watching them from the corner of my eye, scrutinizing their movements, searching for the furtive glance, the sleight of hand that had become so familiar on the kitchen camera footage. I knew it was irrational. These were good people, hired for their warmth as much as their competence. Yet the betrayal I had endured had fundamentally rewired my brain. Trust, once my default setting, now felt like a dangerous indulgence. I took to preparing most of my own simple meals, retreating to the safety of the small kitchenette, in what used to be the servants' wing, a space untouched by Cassandra's presence. This small act of self-preservation felt like a defeat, a concession that they still held power over me, even from behind bars. Sleep offered little respite. Nightmares plagued me, vivid and terrifying replays of the events. I would dream of the metallic taste, so real I would wake up gagging, my heart hammering against my ribs. I would see Dr. Alistair's face, the syringe glinting, or Leo's eyes, burning with murderous rage. I would wake up in the dead of night, drenched in a cold sweat, the silence of the grand bedroom amplifying my fear. I took to sleeping with the lights on, the warm glow a flimsy shield against the darkness in my own mind. The house, my sanctuary, had also been the scene of the crime, and every room held a memory, a ghost. The living room fireplace was where Leo had lunged at me. The dining room table was where they had plotted my demise over meals. The library was where Leo had ground the pills, tainting the very air with his malice. Frank checked in on me regularly, his gruff concern a steadying presence. He saw the toll the aftermath was taking. "You can't live like a prisoner in your own home, Martha," he told me during one of his visits, his gaze taking in my tired eyes and the tension in my shoulders. "They're the ones in a cage. You're free." But was I? I had my freedom, my home, my fortune, but I had lost my peace. I had lost the naive belief that the world was an essentially safe place. I had seen the monster behind the civilized mask, and it was a vision I could not unsee. The turning point, the event that forced me to confront the depth of my trauma, came on a bitterly cold day in January. A letter arrived, bearing a prison postmark. My first instinct was to throw it into the fire, to not let their words, their poison, penetrate the walls of my home again. But a stronger, more defiant part of me, the part that had installed the cameras and faced them down, insisted I read it. The letter was from Leo. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a long, rambling, self-pitying tirade, filled with accusations and venom. He blamed me for everything. For tearing the family apart, for destroying their lives, for tricking them. But it was the final paragraph that burrowed deep into my mind and stayed there. "You think you've won," he wrote, his handwriting a furious scrawl. "You sit in that house, on my father's money, thinking you're safe. But you took everything from us. You'll get what you deserve. People like you always do. The world is full of people who want what you have. You'll never be safe. You'll spend the rest of your miserable life looking over your shoulder, and I hope every second of it is hell." The letter was meant to be a final act of psychological warfare, a poisoned dart sent from his prison cell. And it worked. His words tapped directly into the well of fear that was already bubbling just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed calm. The paranoia intensified. A car slowing down on the road outside the manor sent a jolt of panic through me. A wrong number on the telephone felt like a threat. Leo's voice, his hateful, snarling voice, joined the other ghosts in the house. I began to feel like the fragile, terrified old woman they had always wanted me to be. I was retreating, shrinking, the walls of the manor becoming the boundaries of my prison. One sleepless night, as I wandered the silent, moonlit hallways, I found myself in front of the full-length mirror in the grand foyer. I looked at my reflection, at the woman staring back at me with wide, fearful eyes. This was not the woman who had survived. This was the woman who was letting them win, letting them succeed in murdering my spirit long after their physical attempts had failed. A surge of anger, hot and clean, cut through the fog of fear. I had not come this far only to surrender to the ghosts of my abusers. I had not fought for my life only to live it in fear. The letter was not a prophecy. It was a challenge, and I would not back down. The next morning I made a call. Not to Frank, not to a lawyer, but to a psychiatrist, specializing in trauma. Admitting I needed help felt like another surrender at first, but I quickly realized it was the opposite. It was an act of strength, a declaration of my intent to fight this internal war with the same strategic determination I had used to fight the external one. My first session was difficult. I recounted the story, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. But as I spoke, as I gave voice to the fear and the anger, I felt something shift. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Evans, gave my fear a name: post-traumatic stress disorder. She explained that my paranoia, my nightmares, my hypervigilance were not signs of weakness or psychosis, but normal, predictable responses to an extreme, life-threatening trauma. Giving it a name stripped it of some of its power. It was no longer a nebulous, all-consuming terror, but a condition, a series of symptoms that could be understood, managed, and treated. Our sessions became my new battlefield. We talked about coping mechanisms, about cognitive behavioral therapy, about slowly, deliberately reclaiming the spaces and routines that fear had stolen from me. It was a slow, arduous process. There were setbacks, days when the fear felt insurmountable. But for every step back, I took 2 steps forward. I forced myself to eat a meal prepared by my cook, and when I survived, it was a small victory. I started leaving the lights off at night, armed with breathing techniques to calm my racing heart. I started walking in the gardens again, not just to tend the roses, but to re-inhabit my own life, to feel the sun on my face and not flinch at every sound. Leo's words still echoed sometimes, but they were growing fainter, drowned out by the sound of my own quiet resolve. I was not just a survivor, I was a fighter. The battle for Stirling Manor was over, but the battle for Martha was just beginning, and it was a fight I was determined to win. The therapy sessions with Dr. Evans were like lancing a wound. The process was painful, but it allowed the poison of the trauma to drain away, slowly replaced by understanding and a renewed sense of strength. We worked through the layers of my experience, not just the fear but the profound grief and the complex, unsettling anger. I grieved for the 15 years of love and trust. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With Richard, a time that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what his children were capable of. I grieved for the loss of my own innocence, the simple belief in the goodness of people, and I learned to accept my anger, to see it not as a destructive force, but as the engine of my survival. It was anger that had fueled my fight, anger that had given me the clarity to set the traps and see them through. As the months passed and the grip of the PTSD began to loosen, a new, unfamiliar feeling started to emerge, a profound sense of emptiness. I had won. I had my home, my security, my life. But my life, once so full with Richard, and then so consumed by the fight against his children, now felt vast and unstructured. The days stretched before me, quiet and orderly, but without purpose. Tending the roses and managing the estate were not enough. I felt a restlessness, a deep-seated need to do something more, to give meaning to the horrific ordeal I had endured. I had survived for a reason, and I could not believe it was simply to live out my remaining years in the quiet luxury of Stirling Manor. The idea came to me one afternoon in the library. I was sorting through Richard's old papers, a task I had put off for years. Amidst his business files and investment portfolios, I found a thick folder labeled Sterling Charitable Foundation. Richard had been a generous man, but quietly so. He had established a foundation years ago, primarily to support local arts and education programs. It had been largely dormant since his death, a relic of a life filled with community and connection. As I read through the mission statement he had written, his words seemed to speak to me across the years. Wealth is a responsibility, he had written. Its true value is not in what it can buy, but in the good it can do. In that moment, a new purpose began to crystallize in my mind. The money that Leo and Cassandra had tried to kill me for, the fortune they saw as their birthright, was now my responsibility. Richard's words gave me the key. I could not change what had happened to me, but I could use its outcome, my control of the Stirling estate and fortune, to help others. I could transform this blood money into a force for good. I wouldn't just be a survivor, I would be an advocate. I would become a voice for those who had none, for the other elderly victims of abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation, who were not as lucky or as resourceful as I had been. The idea took root and grew with a ferocious energy. The emptiness I had been feeling was replaced by a surge of focus and determination. This was a new war, but one I would choose to fight. It would not be a defensive war for my own survival, but an offensive one, waged on behalf of others. I called my lawyer the next day, not to discuss my will, but to restructure the Sterling Charitable Foundation. I told him I wanted to change its entire focus. The new mission would be singular and clear: to protect the elderly from abuse and exploitation. We would fund legal aid services for seniors, support shelters for abused elders, invest in public awareness campaigns, and lobby for stronger legislation to protect vulnerable adults. My lawyer, a cautious man named Mr. Abernathy, was taken aback. "Martha, this is a massive undertaking," he warned. "You'll be going up against powerful systems, against families who want to keep these things quiet, against a legal system that often fails the most vulnerable. It will make you a target." "Mr. Abernathy," I replied, my voice firm, "I was a target when I was a silent, grieving widow. I was a target when I was locked in my own home being slowly poisoned. I would rather be a target fighting for something I believe in than a target waiting for the next threat to emerge. My attackers thought this money was their key to a life of leisure. I'm going to make it their legacy of justice." The work consumed me. I threw myself into it with the same meticulous energy I had once reserved for planning a garden, or, more recently, for documenting a criminal conspiracy. The library at Sterling Manor transformed from a place of ghostly memories into a command center. I spent my days on the phone, connecting with nonprofits, legal experts, and social workers. I read everything I could find about elder abuse, the statistics staggering me. For every case like mine that made the headlines, there were thousands that went unnoticed, thousands of victims suffering in silence, disbelieved, isolated, or too terrified to speak out. Their stories resonated with my own, and their silent suffering fueled my resolve. We established a hotline, a confidential resource for people to report abuse or seek help. We funded a team of lawyers who specialized in challenging predatory guardianships and fraudulent wills. We started developing educational materials for banks, hospitals, and community centers to help them recognize the subtle signs of elder abuse. Each step, each small victory, felt more satisfying than any courtroom verdict. I was no longer just Martha, the survivor of the Sterling Manor plot. I was the head of the Sterling Foundation for Elder Justice, a name that felt more truly my own than any other. Of course, not everyone was pleased. I received a letter from Cassandra's lawyer, a thinly veiled threat suggesting my new crusade was a violation of her privacy and could be seen as a form of harassment. It was laughable, but it was a reminder that the world was still full of people who would defend the abusers over the abused. The letter, however, did not frighten me. It invigorated me. It was proof that I was making waves, that I was disrupting the quiet, comfortable world where people like Leo and Cassandra believed they could operate with impunity. One evening, Frank came to visit, finding me buried under a mountain of paperwork at Richard's old desk. He looked at the whiteboards I had installed, covered in strategic plans and flowcharts. "I thought you'd be taking it easy, enjoying the quiet life," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "The quiet life is overrated, Frank," I told him, looking up with a smile. "I think I've finally found what I'm supposed to be doing. Richard built an empire with this money. His children tried to steal it to fund a life of depravity. I'm going to use it to build an army." He looked at me, at the fire in my eyes, the passion in my voice. He saw not a victim, not a grieving widow, but a general. "Well, General," he said, his smile widening, "sign me up for duty." The emptiness was gone. The echoes in the silence had been replaced by the ringing of the telephone, the tapping of keyboards, the hum of purpose. I had transformed my personal tragedy into a public mission. My pain had become my power, and I was just beginning to learn how to wield it. The Sterling Foundation for Elder Justice was no longer just an idea or a mission statement on paper. It was a functioning entity, a growing force. Our hotline, managed by a team of trained counselors and social workers, was fielding dozens of calls a day. We had provided funding for legal representation in over 20 cases, helping seniors reclaim stolen assets and escape abusive situations. But the work felt distant, managed through phone calls and financial reports from the command center of my library. I felt an increasing pull to be on the front lines, to connect with the people we were trying to help, to see the impact of our work firsthand. I needed to ensure this army I was building was fighting the right battles. The opportunity came in the form of a call to the hotline from a woman named Sarah. Her voice was thin and frayed with worry. She was calling about her grandfather, an 85-year-old man named George Bellwether, who lived in a small town about 2 hours away. George, a retired history professor and a widower, had recently had a fall. His only son, a man named Thomas, had moved in to, quote, take care of him. But since Thomas's arrival, Sarah had been systematically cut off from her grandfather. Her calls went unanswered. Her visits were blocked at the door by Thomas, who claimed George was too tired or confused to see her. The bank had also called her, concerned about a series of large, unusual cash withdrawals from George's account. Sarah's story was a chilling echo of my own. The isolation of the victim, the concerned relative being pushed away, the sudden financial irregularities. It was the classic playbook. She had gone to the local police, but they had been dismissive. Thomas was his son, they'd said. It was a family matter, they had no grounds to intervene. She had called Adult Protective Services, but their caseload was overwhelming, and without clear evidence of physical harm. Her report had been buried in a mountain of paperwork. She was desperate, her voice cracking as she told the counselor, I feel like he's a prisoner in his own home, and I'm afraid of what's happening to him. When the case file landed on my desk, I felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond the familiar patterns. I remembered George Bellwether. He had been a colleague of Richard's at the university years ago, a brilliant, kind man with a booming laugh and a passion for Roman history. Richard and I had been to his home for dinner once, a cozy, book-filled house that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. The thought of this vibrant man being isolated and victimized by his own son filled me with a cold, protective fury. This case would be different. I would not delegate it. This would be my first direct intervention. I called Frank. I need a discreet investigation, Frank. The target is Thomas Bellwether. I want to know everything about him, his finances, his associates, any history of trouble, and I want surveillance on George Bellwether's house. I want to know who comes and goes, and I want eyes inside if possible. Martha, are you sure you want to get this personally involved? He cautioned. This is what you pay people for. This one is personal, Frank, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Richard respected this man, and this is exactly the kind of situation the foundation was created for. The system has failed him. We won't. Frank's report on Thomas Bellwether came back within a week, and it was grim. Thomas was a man drowning in debt. He had a string of failed businesses, a serious gambling problem, and was being pursued by several creditors. He was the perfect storm of desperation and entitlement, a man who likely saw his aging father not as a person, but as a lifeline, a walking bank account to be drained. The surveillance on the house confirmed our fears. Thomas rarely left. Deliveries of expensive electronics and fancy takeout food were frequent. While there was no sign of George at all, the windows were always curtained. It was time for the next step. I couldn't legally plant cameras inside the house as I had in my own, but there were other ways to get a message to George, to let him know he wasn't alone. I remembered from our dinner party years ago that George was a creature of habit. He had a bird feeder just outside his study window, which he filled every morning without fail, a small ritual he had cherished. It was a long shot, but it was the only opening I could see. I dispatched one of Frank's operatives, a resourceful young woman named Eva. Posing as a representative from a local ornithological society conducting a survey, she managed to get close to the house. While Thomas was distracted by a delivery, Eva quickly and discreetly attached a tiny, weatherproof device to the underside of the bird feeder. It wasn't a camera or a microphone. It was a miniature signaling device, capable of transmitting a simple, repeating, low-frequency signal that could be picked up by a specialized receiver. More importantly, I had her leave a small laminated card tucked into the feeder's rain guard, a card that looked like a standard identification tag for the survey. On the back, in small print, were the words, Professor Bellwether, if you are in need of assistance, press and hold the button on the device under this feeder for 5 seconds. Help is listening, a friend of Richard Sterling. It was a delicate, risky maneuver. We didn't know if George was physically capable of getting to the feeder, or if Thomas was now managing it. We didn't know if he would find the card, or if he would trust its message. All we could do was wait. For 3 agonizing days, there was nothing. The surveillance team watched the house. Thomas came and went, looking more relaxed and confident with each passing day. I began to fear we were too late, that George was too sick, too sedated, or too frightened to act. Then, on the 4th morning at dawn, it happened. The receiver in the surveillance van parked down the street chirped to life, the signal from the bird feeder pulsing steadily. George had seen the message. He was calling for help. The protocol I had established with Frank and the local authorities who were now far more willing to listen thanks to a significant donation from the Sterling Foundation to their community outreach program, kicked into high gear. Within 15 minutes, 2 police cruisers and a paramedic unit pulled quietly into George Bellwether's driveway, their lights off. With them was a lawyer from the foundation, armed with a court order for a wellness check, an order we had been able to secure thanks to the evidence from Frank's initial investigation. I wasn't there myself, but Frank described the scene to me over the phone. They knocked on the door. A belligerent Thomas answered, demanding to know what was going on. When presented with the court order, he tried to refuse them entry, but the officers pushed past him. They found George in his study. He was frail, emaciated, and locked in from the outside. He was alive, but only just. He had seen the card that morning and, with the last of his strength, had shuffled to the window and pressed the button, holding it down with a trembling finger until he saw the official cars arrive. George was taken to the hospital, weak and malnourished, but safe. Thomas Bellwether was arrested on the spot, his sputtering denials and threats dissolving into whimpers as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The first ripple had become a wave. We had done it. We had pulled a man back from the brink. Using the same tactics of surveillance and strategic thinking that I had used to save myself. As I hung up the phone with Frank, I looked out the window of my library. The world looked brighter, the colors sharper. The emptiness I had felt was gone, replaced by the profound, deeply satisfying warmth of a life saved, of justice served. This was my new purpose. This was my real victory. And it was only the beginning. Battle. The successful rescue of George Bellwether was a watershed moment for the Foundation and for me. It was tangible proof that our methods worked, that we could pierce the veil of silence and isolation that so often surrounds elder abuse. The story, carefully and anonymously leaked to a sympathetic journalist by Frank, garnered regional attention. It was a story of hope, a story of a community protecting one of its own. Our hotline lit up. Donations, both large and small, began to pour in. We were no longer just a fledgling organization. We were becoming a recognized force. With this newfound recognition, however, came a new, more complex set of challenges. For every straightforward case like Thomas Bellwether, a man driven by simple greed and desperation, we began to uncover situations that were far more insidious. We started seeing patterns, names of lawyers, doctors, and professional guardians appearing again and again in the stories of our callers. It was like cutting off the head of a hydra, only to find 2 more growing in its place. These weren't just isolated family tragedies, this was a cottage industry. The case that peeled back this ugly layer of systemic corruption came to us from the heart of the city. It involved a woman named Eleanor Vance, a wealthy 80-year-old artist with no children, who had been placed under a professional guardianship after being diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The petition for guardianship had been filed by her building manager after she'd forgotten to pay her maintenance fees for 2 months. The court, seeing a wealthy woman with a cognitive diagnosis and no immediate family, had acted swiftly, appointing a man named Marcus Thorne as her professional guardian. On paper, Marcus Thorne was a model citizen. He was a court-appointed fiduciary, a respected member of several legal associations, a man entrusted by the state to protect its most vulnerable citizens. But according to the frantic calls we received from Eleanor's lifelong friend, a woman named Beatrice, Thorne was systematically liquidating Eleanor's assets. Her valuable art collection was being sold off at a fraction of its value to a private gallery with which Thorne had a suspiciously close relationship. Her apartment, worth millions, was being prepared for sale. Meanwhile, Eleanor herself had been moved from her luxurious home into a bleak, state-funded nursing facility, where her health was rapidly declining. Beatrice, like so many others we'd heard from, was being denied access, told that her visits were too agitating for Eleanor. "He's stealing her life, Mrs. Sterling," Beatrice wept over the phone. "He has the full protection of the court, and no one will listen to me. They say he is acting in her quote, best interest. Is it in her best interest to die alone in a sterile room while he sells her memories to the highest bidder?" This was a different kind of monster. Marcus Thorne wasn't a desperate gambler like Thomas Bellwether. He was a sophisticated predator who wielded the law itself as his weapon. He operated in the open, cloaked in the legitimacy of the courts, his actions sanctioned by the very system designed to prevent such abuse. He was a pillar of a corrupt system, and I knew that taking him on would be far more dangerous than confronting my own stepchildren. "We're going to need more than surveillance, Frank," I said, after he had given me his initial report on Thorne. "This man's armor is made of legal documents and court orders. We need to find a chink in it." The investigation into Marcus Thorne became an obsession. Frank and his team dug into his life, while the Foundation's legal team, led by a brilliant and tenacious young lawyer named Anya Sharma, began examining every guardianship case Thorne had ever handled. A pattern quickly emerged. Thorne specialized in clients like Eleanor, wealthy, elderly individuals with no close family to advocate for them. In every case, the story was the same. A diagnosis of cognitive decline, a swift court appointment, the isolation of the client, and the rapid liquidation of assets, often sold to the same network of associates for suspiciously low prices. He was getting kickbacks at every stage, all while billing his victims' estates exorbitant fees for his services. He wasn't just stealing, he was profiting from the legal and medical systems that were supposed to be safeguards. The doctors who diagnosed his clients, the real estate agents who sold their homes, the art appraisers, they were all part of his network, a circle of vultures feeding on the vulnerable. The challenge was that everything he did was, on the surface, legal. Every sale was approved by a probate court judge, a man with whom Thorne played golf every Thursday. Every medical decision was backed by a doctor's report. He had perfected the art of using the system's own bureaucracy and inertia to his advantage. A direct legal challenge would be difficult, a long and expensive battle against a man who would use his victims' own money to defend himself. I knew we had to be smarter. We had to use Thorne's own methods against him. His strength was his air of unimpeachable respectability. We had to shatter that illusion. We started by building a coalition. I personally met with Beatrice and several other friends and family members of Thorne's other victims, people who had been pushed away and silenced just like her. Their stories, when woven together, created a powerful and undeniable narrative of a predator at work. We weren't just fighting for Eleanor Vance anymore. We were fighting for a dozen silent victims. The next step was to create a situation that the court and the public could not ignore. Anya, our lawyer, discovered that one of Eleanor's most valuable paintings, a piece by a renowned modern artist, had been sold to Thorne's preferred gallery for a pittance, and was now slated for a high-profile public auction, where it was expected to fetch 10 times what the gallery had paid. This was our opening. You planned our move to coincide with the night of the auction. As the city's elite gathered, sipping champagne and preparing to bid, we struck. We didn't file a lawsuit, we held a press conference. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Beatrice and the families of 6 other victims. I did not name Marcus Thorne directly. I did not make accusations that could be challenged as slander. I simply told a story. I spoke of a pattern of troubling guardianships in our city. I spoke of vulnerable citizens being isolated from their loved ones. I spoke of treasured assets being sold off in questionable circumstances. And then, I announced that the Sterling Foundation was establishing a multi-million-dollar legal defense fund specifically to challenge predatory guardianship cases in the state. Simultaneously, a well-known investigative journalist, whom Frank had been carefully feeding information to for weeks, published a detailed exposé online. The article laid out the network, the pattern of sales, the connections between Thorn, the gallery, the doctors, and the judge. It didn't make a direct accusation of criminality, but it asked pointed, devastating questions. The 1-2 punch was devastating. The story exploded. The auction was halted. The gallery was suddenly under intense scrutiny. The judge Thorn played golf with was forced to recuse himself from all of Thorn's cases. The Hydra was wounded, its heads turning on each other in panic. We hadn't just challenged one man. We had declared war on a corrupt system, and the battle was just beginning. Marcus Thorn, I knew, would not take this lying down. The fight was about to get much, much dirtier. Marcus Thorn was not a man who would engage in a screaming match or a physical altercation. His weapons were far more subtle and, in many ways, more dangerous. He was a creature of the shadows, a master of insinuation and manipulation. My public press conference had forced him into the light, and he reacted not with panicked denials, but with a cold, calculated campaign designed to destroy my credibility and dismantle the foundation from the inside out. The attack did not come like a thunderclap. It came like a fog, creeping in from all directions, quiet and suffocating. It began with whispers. Suddenly, articles began appearing in gossip columns and on fringe blogs, painting me as a vindictive, publicity-hungry widow. My own tragic story was twisted and reframed. Anonymous sources claimed I had driven my stepchildren to desperation with my controlling behavior. The poisoning, they hinted, was a fabrication, a hysterical fantasy. One had concocted to seize the family fortune. They used my new role as an advocate against me, portraying me as a woman on a reckless crusade, a black widow, using her tragic past to meddle in the private affairs of other families. The narrative was clever, designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me seem unstable and unreliable. Next came the legal harassment. A flurry of lawsuits were filed against the foundation, not by Thorn himself, but by a series of shell corporations and aggrieved-sounding family members of his victims, whom we later discovered he was paying. They were frivolous suits, alleging invasion of privacy, defamation of character, and emotional distress. Anya and our legal team knew they were baseless and would eventually be dismissed, but that wasn't the point. The point was to bleed us dry, to bog us down in endless paperwork and depositions, to drain our resources and distract us from our real work. It was a war of attrition, and Thorn had deep pockets. Pockets lined with the money he had stolen from his victims. The campaign then turned inward, targeting the foundation itself. One of our most promising young lawyers was suddenly offered a partnership at a prestigious firm with ties to Thorn, an offer too good to refuse. A significant donor pulled their funding, citing concerns about our increasingly aggressive and litigious tactics. I even discovered that one of our hotline volunteers, a sweet-faced young woman, had been secretly recording our internal meetings and feeding information back to Thorn's associates. The sense of betrayal was sickeningly familiar. Thorn was trying to poison my foundation just as Leo and Cassandra had tried to poison my body, slowly, insidiously, and from the inside. The pressure was immense. The constant legal battles were draining. The public smear campaign was demoralizing, and the internal betrayals bred an atmosphere of suspicion. I felt the old paranoia creeping back, the fear that I couldn't trust anyone. For a few dark weeks I considered giving up. The fight felt unwinnable. Thorn was too connected, the system too corrupt. My army felt scattered, my resources dwindling. I was alone again, fighting a monster with 1,000 faces. It was Beatrice, Eleanor Vance's friend, who pulled me back from the brink. She came to see me at the manor, her face etched with worry. "I've seen what they're writing about you, Martha," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "I've heard the rumors. Don't you dare let them win. Don't you dare let that man silence you, the way he silenced all of us for so long." She handed me a stack of letters. They were from the other families we had united, the other victims of Thorn's network. They were letters of support, of gratitude, of encouragement. They shared their own stories of being intimidated and harassed by Thorn. They offered their time, their savings, their voices. They reminded me that this was no longer just my fight. You didn't build an army to have it scatter at the first sign of a real battle. Beatrice said, her eyes meeting mine with fierce intensity. "We are your army, Martha. You just need to lead us." Her words were a tonic. She was right. I had been trying to fight Thorn on his terms, in the back alleys of the legal system and the muck of public opinion. That was his territory. I needed to change the battlefield. I needed to fight this war in the open, with the truth as my only weapon. Thorn's power came from the shadows, from the quiet, respectable corridors of power. I had to drag him and his entire corrupt system into the harsh, unforgiving light of day for all to see. That evening, I called a meeting of my core team, Frank, Anya, and a few trusted board members. "We're going to stop playing defense," I announced. "From now on, we attack." The plan we devised was bold, bordering on reckless. We would consolidate all the frivolous lawsuits into a single, massive, racketeering RICO lawsuit against Marcus Thorn and his entire network of co-conspirators. We would allege a criminal conspiracy to defraud the state and its most vulnerable citizens. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If we lost, it would bankrupt the foundation and destroy my reputation completely. But if we won, we wouldn't just stop Thorn. We would set a legal precedent that could dismantle similar networks across the country. To fund this massive legal undertaking, I did something I had never thought I would do. I decided to sell Sterling Manor. The house was my sanctuary, the last physical link to my life with Richard. But it was also a fortress, a place I could hide. And I was done hiding. The foundation, the mission, was my home now. Richard's legacy wasn't in the stones of a house, it was in the good we could do with the resources he had left behind. The sale of the manor would give us the war chest we needed to fight Thorn and 100 others like him. It was a sacrifice, but it was also a liberation. I was no longer defending a property, I was leading a movement. The Whispering campaign had been designed to isolate and break me. Instead, it had galvanized me, clarified my purpose, and forced me to become the leader my army was waiting for. The decision to sell Sterling Manor sent a shockwave through my own team, and eventually, through the circles Marcus Thorn traveled in. It was a clear, unambiguous declaration of war. This was no longer a hobby for a wealthy widow. It was an all-in, burn-the-boats commitment. The sale provided the foundation with an enormous influx of capital, more than enough to fund our RICO lawsuit and expand our operations for years to come. I moved into a comfortable but far more modest apartment in the city, turning the page on a chapter of my life and embracing my new role completely. But even with a full war chest, I knew we couldn't win this fight with money and lawyers alone. Thorn's power was built on relationships, on a network of insiders who protected each other. We needed our own network, our own insiders. We needed to find the cracks in his fortress and pry them open. The key, I realized, lay with the very people his system had chewed up and spat out. Our greatest asset was the quiet army of victims and their families. I began by reaching out to Sarah, George Bellwether's granddaughter. After her grandfather's rescue, Sarah, a sharp and tech-savvy graphic designer in her late 20s, had become a passionate volunteer for the foundation. She managed our social media presence, creating powerful infographics and sharing anonymized stories that put a human face on the issue of elder abuse. She possessed a fiery, youthful idealism that was the perfect complement to my strategic patience. I invited her to lunch. "Sarah," I said, getting straight to the point. "We are fighting a man who controls information and manipulates systems. We need to do the same, but for good. I need more than a social media manager. I need a director of intelligence." Sarah's eyes lit up. "What do you have in mind?" "I want you to build a community," I explained. "A secure online network where the families of Thorn's victims and victims of other predatory guardians can connect, share information, and support each other. We've been fighting these battles in isolation. Imagine the power if all these disparate voices started speaking as one. Imagine the data we could collect." It was a brilliant synergy of our skills. My resources and strategic vision, her technological know-how and ability to connect with a younger generation of concerned relatives. Sarah took to the task with incredible zeal. Within a month, she had built the Quoten Watch, a secure, encrypted online portal. It started with the dozen or so families involved in the Thorn case, but it grew exponentially as word spread through whispers and private messages. It became a place for people to vent their frustrations, but more importantly, it became a massive, crowdsourced intelligence-gathering operation. Someone would post about a suspicious doctor who had declared their parent incompetent, and 3 other people would respond, "That was my mother's doctor too." Someone else would mention a realtor who had sold their father's house for a low price, and a new thread would explode with similar stories about the same realtor. Sarah and her team of volunteers began to map these connections, creating a complex web that visualized the staggering scale of Thorn's, and others, operations. They were uncovering the Hydra's nervous system. The Guardian Watch provided us with dozens of new witnesses for our lawsuit. People who had been too afraid or isolated to come forward before, but its most crucial contribution was an unexpected one. One evening, Sarah called me, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Martha, you need to see this. A new user just posted in the forum. She's a paralegal. She says she used to work for Marcus Thorn." The woman's name was Chloe. She was young, idealistic, and had taken the job at Thorn's firm right out of school, believing she would be helping vulnerable people. It took her 6 months to realize what was truly happening, to see the cold, predatory greed behind the mask of legal respectability. She had quit, horrified, but was terrified of speaking out, convinced Thorn would destroy her career before it had even begun. But finding the Guardian Watch, seeing the dozens of other people whose lives had been shattered by her former boss, had given her the courage to take a risk. I arranged a meeting with Chloe, with Anya and Frank present. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. But as she started talking, her fear gave way to a steely resolve. She provided us with the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. She explained Thorn's filing system, his use of shell corporations, and his methods for hiding the kickbacks he received. But her most important contribution was a single explosive piece of information. "He has a ledger," she whispered, leaning forward. "Not on a computer. It's an old-fashioned handwritten book. He calls it his insurance policy. He keeps a detailed record of every illicit payment he's ever made and ever received. It includes payments to doctors, to realtors, and to judges. He told me once, you never know when your friends might become your enemies. He keeps it in a safe, hidden behind a false panel in his home office." This was it, the smoking gun. The key to not just defeating Thorn in a civil suit, but to putting him and his entire corrupt network in prison. The problem was, we couldn't legally get our hands on it. A search warrant would be almost impossible to obtain based on the testimony of a disgruntled former employee. We had to force Thorn to reveal it himself. The plan we concocted was my most audacious yet. It involved using the information from Guardian Watch to create a series of targeted leaks to the press, exposing Thorn's smaller secondary schemes one by one. We exposed the art gallery, which was promptly raided by the state attorney general. We exposed a doctor in his network, who was suspended pending an investigation by the medical board. We were creating a panic, making his co-conspirators believe that the ship was sinking, and the authorities were closing in. Our goal was to make Thorn so paranoid, so terrified, that one of his friends would cut a deal and testify against him, that he would feel the need to move his insurance policy. Frank's team placed his home office under 24/7 surveillance. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Thorn was a cool customer. Then, one night, our gambit paid off. The pressure had become too much. At 2 a.m., surveillance caught Thorn deactivating his alarm system, opening the hidden safe, and removing a thick, leather-bound ledger. He placed it in a briefcase and drove, not to a bank or a lawyer's office, but to a self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city. He was trying to hide the evidence outside of his immediate possession. The moment he drove away, Frank called the authorities. Because Thorn had moved the ledger, and because we could provide clear evidence that it contained material related to ongoing criminal investigations, they now had the probable cause they needed for a warrant to search the storage unit. The circle was complete. The unlikely alliance of a grieving widow, a tech-savvy millennial, and a terrified young paralegal had brought down a kingpin. We had used community, technology, and insider knowledge to defeat a man who thrived on isolation, secrecy, and corruption. The war wasn't over, but we had just won its most decisive battle. Resec. The raid on the self-storage facility was executed with the quiet, overwhelming force of a lightning strike. There was no drama, no standoff. The federal agents, armed with the warrant we had gift-wrapped for them, simply cut the lock on Unit 247 and stepped inside. Frank called me from the scene, his voice tight with a satisfaction he rarely allowed himself to show. "Martha," he said, "you're not going to believe this. It's not just one ledger, it's a library." Thorne's insurance policy was more than a single book. It was a meticulously organized archive of corruption spanning 15 years. There were a dozen leather-bound ledgers, supplemented by USB drives containing copies of incriminating emails, bank statements, and illegal wire transfers. Thorne hadn't just been protecting himself from his co-conspirators. He had been building a case against every single one of them. He had documented every bribe paid to a court clerk, every kickback from a real estate agent, every consulting fee paid to a doctor for a convenient diagnosis, and most damningly, every cash-filled envelope passed to the probate court judge he played golf with every Thursday. He had created a perfect, self-contained roadmap of his own criminal enterprise. It was the work of a profoundly arrogant and paranoid man, and his own meticulous paranoia was about to be his undoing. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Armed with the contents of Thorne's treasure trove, the U.S. Attorney's Office moved with breathtaking speed. The morning after the raid, a wave of arrests swept across the city and state. Marcus Thorne was arrested at his lavish home, reportedly so stunned he was unable to speak. The probate judge was arrested in his chambers, a moment of profound shock to the city's legal establishment. The doctors, the art gallery owner, the real estate agents, Thorne's entire network of vultures, were rounded up in a single, coordinated operation. It was the largest corruption scandal in the state's history, and the Sterling Foundation was at the very center of it. The media narrative shifted overnight. The whispers and smears against me and the foundation evaporated, replaced by headlines praising our, quote, tenacious investigation and, quote, courageous advocacy. The journalist Frank had been working with published a series of explosive articles, using the now public details from the arrest warrants to lay bare the entire sordid system. I was no longer a meddling widow. I was the woman who had brought down a kingpin. But I felt no need for vindication. The real victory was not in the headlines, but in the quiet human consequences of the network's collapse. Eleanor Vance was moved out of the bleak nursing home and, under a new, court-appointed guardian chosen with our oversight, was settled into a beautiful assisted living facility surrounded by her own art, which the foundation helped recover. Beatrice could visit her every day. The other families, the members of our guardian watch, saw their own cases suddenly taken seriously. Court-appointed guardians were reviewed, assets were frozen, and for the first time, these families were being listened to by the very system that had once silenced them. Our RICO lawsuit, which had once seemed so audacious, was now the least of Thorne's problems. He and his co-conspirators were facing a battery of federal charges for racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. They were facing decades in prison. The system of whispers and intimidation Thorne had built was shattered, its members now desperately trying to cut deals, to turn on each other to save themselves, just as he had always feared they would. I stood in the foundation's bustling office, a large, open-plan space we'd leased in a downtown building, watching the news reports flash across the television screens. Sarah stood beside me, her eyes shining. "We did it, Martha," she said, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." "No, Sarah," I corrected her gently, looking around at the lawyers, counselors, and volunteers working the phones, compiling data, and talking to families. "We all did it. This is what happens when people stop being afraid and start talking to each other." That afternoon, Anya Sharma, our lead counsel, came into my office and closed the door. "We've received an offer," she said, her expression a mixture of triumph and disbelief, "from Marcus Thorne's attorneys. He's willing to plead guilty to all charges and cooperate fully." "In exchange for what?" I asked. A reduced sentence, of course, Anya said. But that's not his main condition. He wants to talk to you. Alone. Frank, when I told him, was vehemently against it. Absolutely not. It's a trap. He'll try to intimidate you, manipulate you. There's no reason for you to see him. But I knew I had to. This was the final move in the chess game. Our confrontation hadn't been in a living room with a syringe, but across a city, using legal briefs and media leaks as our weapons. He had made his final move by getting caught, and now I had to make mine. This wasn't about gloating or revenge. It was about understanding. I wanted to look my enemy in the eye, not to see him broken, but to understand the nature of the beast I had been fighting. I'll do it, I told Anya. Set it up. The reckoning was complete. Now it was time for the final accounting. Wastasakar Maili ni I. The meeting took place in a sterile, featureless room at the Federal Detention Center. The air smelled of disinfectant and despair. Marcus Thorne sat across from me at a simple metal table. Dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that was a world away from his tailored suits, he looked smaller, diminished without the trappings of his wealth and power, but his eyes were the same, cold, intelligent, and unnervingly calm. There were no lawyers present, just two impassive guards standing by the door. This was the conversation he had bargained for. Benaumanafidi, he was the first to speak, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of its usual smooth confidence. Martha Sterling, he said, less a greeting and more an acknowledgement, as if identifying a rare and fascinating specimen. I must confess, I underestimated you. That seems to be a common mistake people in your line of work make, I replied, my own voice steady. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing any fear or hesitation. A faint, mirthless smile touched his lips. Indeed. I studied you, of course, after you made your little speech on the courthouse steps. I read the stories about what happened with your stepchildren. A clever bit of work with the cameras. I was impressed. But I categorized you as a survivor, a victim who got lucky. I failed to identify you as a peer. The word peer hung in the air between us. It was a shocking, offensive, and strangely insightful choice. He saw in my strategic thinking, in my meticulous planning and ruthless execution, a reflection of his own abilities. He wasn't seeing me as a force for good, but as a competitor in the same game, just playing for a different team. We are not peers, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice like ice. I don't destroy lives for profit. Don't you? He countered, leaning forward slightly. You've certainly destroyed mine, and the lives of my associates. You've dismantled a system that, in its own way, was quite efficient. You see, you look at me, and you see a monster. But I was simply a service provider. I catered to a fundamental human desire. Greed. Children who didn't want to wait for their inheritance. Relatives who wanted to get rid of a problem. I provided a solution that was cleaner than a violent crime, and sanctioned by the very courts you profess to revere. I was a symptom, Mrs. Sterling, not the disease. You were a predator who exploited the sick and the lonely, I shot back. You cloaked your greed in the language of legality and fiduciary duty. You didn't just steal their money, you stole their dignity, their final years, their right to die in peace, surrounded by people who cared. And you, he said, his eyes narrowing, you have cloaked your own need for power and control in the language of justice and advocacy. Don't fool yourself into thinking you are purely altruistic. I saw how you operated. The calculated media leaks, the coalition building, the way you weaponized public sentiment, the move to sell your home, brilliant. A masterstroke of public relations and strategic financing. It was beautiful to watch. You didn't just want to stop me. You wanted to annihilate me. You wanted to win. His words were insidious, designed to crawl under my skin to make me question my own motives. And for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment, he succeeded. Had my crusade become a personal vendetta? Was my satisfaction in his downfall more about victory than about justice? I looked at this man, this hollowed-out shell of power, and I saw the truth. My methods might have been as strategic as his, but my purpose was the thing that separated our worlds entirely. You're right about one thing, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. I did want to win. I wanted to win for Eleanor Vance, in George Bellwether, and the dozens of others you left to rot while you played golf with a crooked judge. I wanted to win for every person who has ever been made to feel powerless and invisible by men like you. My satisfaction doesn't come from your destruction, Mr. Thorne. It comes from their restoration. That is the difference between us. That is the chasm you will never understand. I stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. Your insurance policy was your ultimate miscalculation. You documented your own evil so perfectly, you left no room for doubt. You were so busy watching your friends that you never saw the real threat coming. He watched me as I walked toward the door. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine emotion in his eyes. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was the look of a grandmaster in a chess game who has just been put into an inescapable checkmate by an unexpected opponent. He had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated. "Martha," he called out, his voice stopping me at the door. I turned back. "Be careful," he said. "When you dedicate your life to hunting monsters, you risk becoming one yourself. The abyss, as they say, gazes also into you." "I'll take my chances," I said, and walked out of the room without looking back. The trials of Marcus Thorne and his network were a formality. Faced with the mountain of evidence from the ledgers and the testimony of co-conspirators who had turned state's evidence, the verdicts were a clean sweep. Thorne was sentenced to life in federal prison, the judge declaring him a, quote, cancer on the justice system. His cronies received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. The system, for once, had worked, because we had forced it to. In the year that followed, the Sterling Foundation for Elder Justice grew from a regional force into a national model. The RICO lawsuit had set a powerful legal precedent, and our methods, the combination of investigation, legal action, and community organizing through platforms like the Guardian Watch, were being replicated across the country. I was no longer just running a foundation. I was at the helm of a movement. I testified before Congress, advocating for reforms to the guardianship system. I spoke at law schools, urging a new generation of lawyers to fight for the vulnerable, not exploit them. I never moved back into a grand manor. My city apartment became my home and my sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection away from the demands of my public life. The ghosts of Sterling Manor had finally been laid to rest, replaced by the fulfilling work that now filled my days. My life was no longer defined by the trauma I had endured, but by the purpose I had forged from it. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood in the Foundation's conference room, which we had named the Richard Sterling Hall of Justice. I was watching Sarah, who was now the Foundation's executive director, as she briefed a group of visiting advocates from another state, explaining the methodology of the Guardian Watch portal. She spoke with a passion and authority that made my heart swell with pride. She, and the dozens of other young people who now worked for the Foundation, were the future of this fight. Frank, now officially retired but serving as the pro bono head of our investigations unit, leaned against the doorframe beside me. "You built something incredible here, Martha," he said, his gruff voice laced with genuine admiration. "We built it," I corrected him. I thought of Beatrice, Chloe the paralegal, and the hundreds of families on the Guardian Watch. This was their legacy as much as it was mine. My mind drifted to Marcus Thorne's final warning in that prison meeting room. "When you dedicate your life to hunting monsters, you risk becoming one yourself." Had I? I looked at my reflection in the conference room glass. I saw the lines of age and of battles fought, but I didn't see his cold emptiness. My eyes were not the eyes of a predator who enjoyed the kill, but of a protector who fiercely guarded her flock. I had used strategic thinking, patience, and a certain ruthlessness, the very lessons my abusers had inadvertently taught me. But I had tempered them with empathy, the one quality they had never possessed. I had not become them. I had become their antithesis. After the meeting, Sarah walked with me to my office. "There's a new case I think you should see," she said, handing me a file. "A retirement community in Florida. The developer seems to be using a network of doctors and lawyers to systematically drain the residents' estates." I took the file and opened it. The familiar patterns were all there, a new hydra with new heads. A few years ago, a file like this would have filled me with dread. Now, it filled me with a calm, focused resolve. The war, as Rosemary Whitmore had once said in A Different Life, A Different Story, was far from over. "All right," I said, looking up at Sarah, a new generation's leader. Let's get to work. The game continued. But now I was no longer just a player, nor was I a queen. I was the architect of the board itself, and I was building a world where the rules were finally written to protect the innocent. That was the sterling legacy. Not a house, not a fortune, but a promise. You are not alone. We are listening, and we will fight for you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.